The usual discussion surrounding God of War's story goes something like this. Back in the day, it was a simplistic action game for dum-dums, cavemen, and teenage boys. A story about a brutish and violent main character who cared about nothing but vengeance, and occasionally engaging in sexual intercourse with hot, topless babes. Nice. Until the new games came along and everything changed. The story and characters were transformed in a way that was totally unprecedented. God of War became a genuinely more mature and complex narrative to be appreciated by smart people with big brains. And the female characters put some shirts on, good for them. The very first God of War video essay I ever posted to this channel 2 long years ago followed this same basic summary, and it is by far my most disliked and most controversial video on the series, because there is a core of old guard God of War fans who declare no. They say this is all bullshit. God of War was always deep. Kratos was always a complex character. The Norse games are merely building upon a rich narrative foundation that was always there. The purpose of this video is to take a closer and more thoughtful look at the subject than my first video essay did. Who is correct here? Has the storytelling in God of War actually changed? Has the way its characters are written and developed really become any more complicated? Was God of War always deep? Now, I've been spending a lot of time the past few months replaying all of the Greek God of War games, in anticipation of doing a retrospective series. And what I have come to believe is that the story of God of War always held the potential for great narrative depth. The Norse games did not create a new depth and complexity, they merely brought into the focus something that was always there. God of War's story was definitely always touching on some compelling themes. For example, the effects of repeated violence and betrayal, the slow grinding down of not only Kratos' humanity, but the humanity of nearly every single character in the series. By the end of God of War 3, the story becomes a vicious contest between equally frightening monsters, and it is nearly impossible to tell which of those monsters, between Kratos, Zeus, or Gaia, is actually the one who deserves death. This same theme reappears in the Norse games, particularly with the character of Thor, who, just like Kratos, is defined by the incredible violence he had inflicted on others in the past, but who is now trying to change, and you can see what those old choices have done to him, the miserable person it has turned him into. You could easily make an argument that Baldur, Heimdall, and Odin are all ultimately destroyed by their use of violence too. It is only the characters who choose peace and mercy who emotionally survive the Battle of Ragnarok. While Sindri may technically still be alive after the finale, it is only as a depressed and broken man, and it is no coincidence that he is the one who strikes the final blow. There is also the theme of grief. The corrosive downward cycle of grief, the way it leads characters to lash out at each other, to destroy not only themselves, but everything around them, until there is virtually nothing left. A ruined wasteland forged by a single man's misguided quest to conquer his own past mistakes. The character of Kratos was never a mindless monster. His original goal was never really revenge. Killing Ares in the first game was really only tangential to his true motivation, which was to have his sins forgiven, to be purged of the guilt he feels, for the visions of his past, which haunt and torture him, to be erased. And now that I've spent a lot more time replaying the old games, I would be willing to argue that his ultimate motivation was never revenge, not even when he was brutally slaughtering all of the Olympians in the finale. Instead, I think Kratos was always a character driven by grief. He accidentally killed his own wife and daughter, and everything he does in the entire series, both Greek and Norse, is an attempt to either erase that deed, to distract himself from it, or eventually to redeem himself. Just like the theme of violence, this theme of grief continues right into the Norse games. Grief is everywhere here. Kratos and Atreus grieve the loss of Faye. Freya grieves the loss of Baldur. Thor grieves the loss of Magni and Modi. Sindri grieves the loss of Brock. And no one ever grieves the loss of Heimdall because he was a total douchebag. There is also the cycle of conflict between parents and children. Kratos devours his children to prevent them from rising against him. Zeus then does rise up against him and enslaves his father, Kratos. Ares conspires to overthrow his father Zeus, but ultimately fails. Kratos succeeds in destroying his father Zeus and also slaughters his own child. His violence is directed in both generational directions. The Norse games too are all about the complex series of conflicts between he and his son Atreus, which always has the potential to descend into destruction and violence. Balder is desperate to kill his mother Freya, Thor is arguably responsible for the death of his son Modi, Odin kills his son Thor in cold blood, Angerboda is locked in a terrible conflict with her grandmother. Do you see the way these themes carry right through both the Greek and Norse games? The Norse games are not telling a new story. They are telling the exact same story about the exact same themes. However, with all of that said, the way this story is told has changed dramatically between games, and I do not think anyone can argue otherwise. The real difference between the storytelling in the Greek and Norse games is not in depth or theme or complexity. The difference is in focus and pacing. The Greek games are very gameplay-focused video games. For example, the original God of War is made up almost entirely of action sequences punctuated by frequent puzzle and platforming sections, with very few cutscenes. Throughout all of this action, Kratos is always alone and almost always completely silent. He is not interacting with any other characters, and he only very rarely expresses his own thoughts or feelings. There are only a handful of cutscenes that actually advance the story or reveal anything about his background or motivations. This near total focus on gameplay continues into God of War 2. It is not until the third game that the developers started injecting more dialogue and narrative into the series. I would be very surprised if there is more than a couple hours worth of cutscenes in the entire Greek trilogy, and even the cutscenes that are there are relatively light on dialogue. It seems clear to me that the developers of the Greek games cared about making great gameplay first, and then they squeezed a bit of story in around the edges afterwards. The result is that, despite touching on some really interesting themes, the story almost never has enough space or time to fully develop those themes. As soon as the story starts to get a little complex, the game interrupts itself to rush the player into another grueling series of brutal battles, as if the developers were worried we would get bored if we weren't constantly slaughtering another horde of minions. The Norse games are the exact opposite. These are very narrative-focused video games. There are a ton of cutscenes and they are long and filled with dialogue. The pacing is so much slower. And even when you're not in a cutscene, when you're just traversing the world, Kratos is never ever alone, and he is almost never allowed to be silent. He is traveling with Atreus, Mimir, Freya, Brock, and Sindri, and these characters never shut the hell up. They are constantly blabbing at each other. Like every single minute of the game, Kratos is constantly expressing his thoughts and feelings across a vast range of subjects. It is a night and day difference. I would be willing to bet that God of War 4 has at minimum 50 times as much dialogue as the original game. For this reason alone, the Norse games have so much more space to develop their narrative themes, even if they are the exact same themes that appeared in the previous games. The characters have so much more time to develop, to change, to make new choices, to chew on new ideas, to express a wide range of complicated emotions. Sometimes the new games are so focused on story that it is actually to the detriment of the gameplay. One of the most often criticized sections of Ragnarok is the Ironwood, because at this point in the game the pacing comes to a dead halt. The player spends multiple hours doing basically nothing but going on an extended date with this new character Angerboda, helping her care for her animal friends, skipping rocks, dealing with some family drama. From a gameplay perspective, it is very dull, but from a story perspective, it is fantastic. Ragnarok gives this new character a ton of time to breathe, to give the audience a really clear idea of her backstory, her fears, her dreams, what she really cares about, what she wants out of life. I think Angrboda gets more character development in just this introduction than any supporting character got in the entire Greek trilogy. You see, it is not just about Kratos. A lot of times, old fans, when arguing in favor of the depth of the old games, will say, well, Kratos did this, and Kratos felt that, Kratos was so complex. But what about every other character? What about the supporting cast? Is there any supporting character in the Greek trilogy as complex and surprising, who transforms as dramatically as Freya or Brock or Sindri? So that is my basic answer to the question of whether God of War was always deep. The depth was always there, like a little seed planted in very fertile soil, but never given the space or attention it needed to really thrive. It was the new focus and slower pacing of the Norse games that finally gave that little seed the nourishment it needed to finally spring forth into the beautiful God of War storytelling blossom that we all know and love today. Of course, this analysis is only based on the main Greek trilogy and not on the 3 prequel games, which I find to be a little more of a mixed bag in the storytelling department, but we can discuss those in a different video. And to be entirely accurate, this change in focus did not begin with the Norse games. God of War 3 already had far more cutscenes and dialogue than the previous 2 games. Now, the storytelling in 3 does tend to be a bit clunkier, a bit more heavy-handed, a bit more rushed than that of the most recent entries. I mean, the quality of the writing has definitely improved over time. But it is important to note that by the 3rd game, God of War was already decidedly moving in the direction of becoming a narrative-focused video game series. This was not a sudden transformation, but a gradual one that occurred over many years and multiple releases. The Norse games did not take God of War in a truly new direction. They are the continuation of a change that was already occurring. Now, let's talk a little bit more about that term that fans use, deep. What do we actually mean when we describe a story as deep? What is narrative depth? Really, what I'm asking here is what makes a story good, and how do we know when a story is good? Are there any actual objective criteria by which we can measure the quality of a story? Or is it entirely subjective? Just some people will like a story and some people won't, and there's nothing you can do about it. As someone who has spent his entire adult life attempting and failing to write publishable fiction, this is a question I have spent a lot of time obsessing over and researching, and I will share with you the only satisfying answer I have ever found. When an audience describes a story as deep, they are not actually describing the story at all. Instead, they are describing themselves, their own reaction to that story. For example, how deeply did that story make you feel? How intense were the emotions you experienced? Did it make you cry? Did it make you feel joy? Did it make you feel hopeful or hopeless? Did you hate the characters you were supposed to hate? Did you fall in love with the ones you were supposed to fall in love with? Did the story somehow manage to make you care about the happiness and well-being of completely fake people who only exist on a screen or within the pages of a book? Or were you bored? Did you care about how the story turned out at all? Or from another angle, how deeply did that story make you think? Are there things about the story that you just cannot stop thinking about, even days or weeks after it is already over? Themes or discussions that you just cannot stop turning over in your head over and over again because you just find them so fascinating? Did it introduce ideas that you had never considered before? Or, far more exciting, are there ideas and feelings you've always had that this story finally gave you the words for? Like you can finally describe something inside yourself that you've always known was there but did not know how to express until now. And I think this is what people are talking about when they describe the Greek games as shallow and the Norse games as deep. For example, I have watched this scene where Brock blesses the Draupnir spear 1,000 times. And still, every single time I see it, I tear up. I think there is something so beautiful and so moving about this moment. This tiny interaction between these two characters choosing to support each other, to express their affection for each other in this unexpected way. There is something deeply hopeful in it, like everything is going to work out. Or for another example, I have watched this scene where Sindri mourns the death of his brother 1,000 times too. And still, every time I see it, it makes me feel rotten. It makes me feel terrible. This scene makes me feel hopeless, like there's nothing anyone can do to help this character, to make this better. He is too broken by his grief. When I ask myself, is there any scene in the Greek trilogy that makes me feel emotions as intense as these? I have to answer no, with perhaps one exception that I will discuss later. Like when Kratos throws himself off the cliff in the first game, that is a sad moment. I do feel sorry for him. I can recognize the tragedy that is occurring here, but I definitely am not anywhere near the verge of tears the way I am when Brock is killed. The emotional beats of the Greek games just do not hit me nearly as hard as those in the Norse games, and it is for the reason I have already discussed. There is just not enough time or space to give these moments the emotional payoff they deserve, again with one notable exception to be discussed later. The primary emotions I feel while playing the original trilogy are completely different. The scale of these games is incredible. It is amazing. The seemingly unending gauntlet of desperate battles, the confrontations with colossal, titanic, seemingly undefeatable enemies, the exploration of vast ancient fantasy kingdoms and deadly dungeons full of wicked traps. The adventure you go on is awesome. These games do not make me feel joy and hope and sadness. Instead, the emotional experience of playing these games is an adrenaline rush, a feeling of, oh my gosh, this is crazy. I cannot believe this is actually happening. I have seen a lot of fans criticize the new games because they have lost that feeling, that sense of awe. Compare the battle with Zeus in God of War 3 to the battle with Odin in Ragnarok. Odin feels like just another boss fight, whereas Zeus feels like a true clash between gods, a battle between two immortal beings at the height of their powers, where the very foundations of the earth are trembling, where the fate of the entire world is at stake. Odin just looks like a small fry by comparison. The new games replaced that sense of awe and excitement with something quieter and subtler and more thoughtful. It is not necessarily better, it is just different. However, there is some subjectivity here. The stories that affect me emotionally are going to be different than the stories that affect you emotionally. So I leave this question open to the viewer. Is there any moment in the Greek games that made you feel intense, overwhelming emotions? Like that made you feel so upset that you wanted to turn the game off, that made you feel rotten or terrible, or the opposite, that made you feel joyful and hopeful, something that seemed truly beautiful and special? For me, the answer is mostly no, again with one exception that I promise we are getting closer to discussing, but not yet. Of course, narrative depth is not just about getting your audience to feel, but also about getting your audience to think. This is the other end of the spectrum, the reason why novels like Ulysses by James Joyce or Absalom by William Faulkner, despite being terrible, miserable, boring books to read, are universally recognized as very deep novels, because the ideas and themes they are grappling with, and perhaps even more importantly, the way in which they express those themes is so fascinating. This is the smarty pants side of the narrative depth pool, the sort of stories that make you feel smart if you can appreciate them, and make you feel stupid if you don't. I think this may be a more common definition of the word deep. When people use that word, they are often referring to intellectual depth or academic depth, the sort of book a professor of literature would keep on her bookshelf. This is the thing that made me a bad fit for academia, because what fascinates me about stories is their emotional richness and vibrance, and how that sometimes has the power to alter the audience, to change their beliefs and perception. But I'm getting way off topic here. I would not describe either the Greek or Norse games as intellectually deep. God of War is not the video game equivalent of a Ulysses or a War and Peace. To be honest, I'm not sure what video game could be described that way. Anyway, what makes the story of God of War so fascinating are the emotions, the pathos and the depth of the characters, the dramatic transformation these characters undergo. With that said, I do think God of War touches on some ideas that are genuinely pretty interesting and thought-provoking. For example, one of the themes that I have discussed in depth in other videos is the theme of fate, and the unexpected way that the characters in Ragnarok discuss that theme. At one point in the story, the characters visit the Norns to learn their fate, but what they are told is surprising. The Norns say that there is no such thing as fate, no grand guiding hand leading our characters to their destiny. Instead, the characters are entirely in control of their own destiny. If fate exists at all, then it is defined by their choices. However, because Kratos' choices are determined by his nature, by who he really is deep down inside, he ends up making the same mistakes over and over again. His ultimate destination is predictable and obvious because he refuses to change. Therefore, changing one's fate is as easy and as difficult as simply making a new choice. I do not believe I have ever heard destiny expressed in quite this way before. And of course, the theme of fate appeared in the Greek games too. Kratos and Zeus are both described as attempting to resist prophecy, and then by doing so end up causing the prophecy to come true instead. Obviously, God of War 2 is all about Kratos and a whole slew of other characters, appealing to these sisters of fate to change their destinies. However, the Greek games never had scenes like this one, long, extended discussions in which characters delve into the meaning of fate, its relationship to their own choices, and their own natures, in which multiple perspectives are presented and thoughtfully considered. That is the difference between the storytelling in these games. Okay, to summarize, it is my belief that narrative depth is not determined by the story itself, but instead by the audience's reaction to that story. The reason why the Norse games feel deeper than the Greek games is because their style of storytelling tends to evoke far more intense emotions and much more thoughtful discussions than that of the original trilogy. But the obvious problem with this theory is that audience reactions are subjective, flexible, and changeable. You have probably had the experience where you finished watching some movie or TV show that you really loved, and then you go online and discover that everyone else hates that movie or TV show, and apparently it is actually a stupid piece of media made for idiots. And then your reaction changes. Maybe you cannot enjoy it as much as you did before, now that you are aware of the criticism. Or maybe you have returned to a video game you loved when you were a kid, but you haven't played in years. And then when you finally play it again, you discover, oh wait, oh no, this is not as good as I remember. This game kinda sucks. Or maybe you've heard of a popular new video game that everyone else won't shut up about, a story that everyone else seems to love and praise, but when you play it, the story and characters just don't hook you at all, and you don't understand what makes it so popular or so supposedly meaningful. But then maybe you hop on YouTube and you click on the thumbnail for a video essay like this one, and a smarty pants like me with a beautiful baritone voice describes the complexity of the story. You learn that there was a lot more emotional or intellectual depth there than you realized. The next time you play the game with this new knowledge, your reaction has changed. My point is that narrative depth is not objective. Your experience of a story is probably going to change at least slightly every single time you replay or rewatch or reread that story, because you are constantly changing every single day in both big and small ways, even when you don't realize it. That is what can make these kinds of discussions so perplexing. We are not all on the same page. Before I end this video, I do want to talk a little more about Kratos' character development in the original trilogy. Back in my very first God of War video essay, I stated that I did not think he had very much character development in the older games. And in the comments section of that video, you can find hundreds of people disagreeing with me. And I want to take those disagreements seriously. Is there something here that I have missed? So let's begin with a brief summary of Kratos' character arc in God of War 1, 2, and 3. Kratos begins his story as a consummate warrior, a character who has devoted his entire existence to battle, to leading soldiers in battle, and to winning battles. He is undefeated. His victories fill him with pride, and this pride leads him to keep fighting and fighting and fighting, seeking ever greater glory with no end in sight. Finally, he encounters a foe who he cannot overcome. For the first time in his life, he faces defeat. In truth, he is not defeated by this barbarian horde. He has been destroyed by his own choices, by his unending pride and his violent lifestyle. This is a natural conclusion to the decisions he has made. If it ended there, this story would be nothing but a simple fable about the dangers of pride. But it does not end there, because instead of accepting his fate, Kratos calls out to Ares, the Greek god of war, and pledges himself to the mad god's service in exchange for victory. This is the first crisis point in his story. His decisions have led him to a terrible personal disaster, and now he has been given an opportunity to reconsider those decisions, to make a new choice, to follow a new path. And of course, he ignores any possibility of a new path and instead doubles down on his old choices. In the service of Ares, the scale and depravity of his violence reaches new deplorable heights. He descends deeper and deeper into the ecstatic throes of wanton bloodshed, until it leads him to, unintentionally, commit a truly unforgivable and despicable act. He murders his own wife and daughter, the only people in the world he ever loved or cared for. This is the second crisis point in Kratos' life. Once again, his decisions have led him to a terrible personal disaster. Once again, he has an opportunity to reconsider his choices, his violent lifestyle, his choice to serve an uncaring and tyrannical authority figure, and once again he continues down the same path. He does stop serving Ares, but then shackles himself to the service of the other Olympians instead, who are arguably not much better. In that service, he continues to fight battle after battle, continues to play the role of the violent, undefeatable warrior. The reason he serves them is because the Olympians have promised to forgive him for the sin of murdering his family, and he believes that will include purging him of the visions that plague him. You see, Kratos is haunted by his memories, by the monstrous and evil things he has done. And of course, these memories are really just an expression of his guilt. In truth, what he wants to be freed from are his feelings of guilt. This is the true motivation in the original game. Killing Ares is just sort of a happy accident on the path to accomplishing that goal. The Olympians allow Kratos to believe that they will end his visions, knowing all along that it is impossible because they are a bunch of lying, manipulative assholes who just want to use him as a tool to further their own goals. When Ares leads an attack on Athens, Athena tasks Kratos with slaying the mad god of war to save her city. However, when Kratos, against all odds, actually manages to kill Ares, Athena reveals the truth. The visions that haunt him will never go away. You cannot erase your own guilt. You must live with your mistakes forever. The knowledge that he will never be free of his guilt causes Kratos to lose all hope, and so he chooses self-destruction. He throws himself off a mountain so it can all finally be over. But the story does not end there. In what must be the most misguided hiring decision in the history of video games, Athena saves Kratos and recruits him to be the new god of war. She hands this very clearly emotionally and psychologically unstable and miserable dude incredible power. What could go wrong? With this newfound power in hand, Kratos returns to making the same old mistakes. He finds a new family to replace his old one, this time the warrior legions of Sparta. He becomes sort of obsessed with them, and he interacts with them in the only way he knows how. He leads the Spartans from conquest to conquest, from victory to victory, once again swelling his pride and leaving a path of destruction and bloodshed in his wake. Basically, Kratos has returned to being the exact same character he was at the very beginning of his story. He has not changed at all. All of those disasters his choices led him to in the past are apparently forgotten or just ignored. And of course, as long as he keeps making the same choices, it is going to keep leading him to the same results. When he defies the wishes of Olympus and leads an attack on the city of Rhodes, Zeus strikes him down and then destroys not only the Spartan legions, but the entire city of Sparta as punishment. Once again, Kratos' choices have led to the death of his family. Does this latest crisis cause him to finally reconsider his choices? His violent lifestyle, his anger and his pride, his repeated decision to ally himself with dangerous and selfish authority figures? No, of course not. He allies himself with a new set of dangerous and selfish authority figures instead. This time it's Gaia and the Titans, and he continues to choose violence. After a long detour on the island of creation, he leads an invasion of Mount Olympus itself, an invasion which reaches brand new, unseen heights of violence and devastation. This time, innocents are killed by the tens of thousands. Greece is left a lifeless, broken wasteland. Kratos himself commits some of the most ugly and depraved and unjustified acts of violence in the entire series. Repeated betrayals and exposure to violence have ground his humanity down to nothing. He has transformed into a vengeful and rage-filled monster who does not care about anyone else. But there is still one crisis point left for him to face, one final crossroads, one last opportunity to make a new choice, to become better than his past. And this final crisis is the exception I discussed earlier, the only time in the original Greek trilogy when I felt that God of War was delving into some genuinely deep emotional tissue. So here it is. During his brutal and wrath-filled journey throughout Mount Olympus, he rescues Pandora, the daughter of Hephaestus. With her girlish appearance and wish to make the world a better place, Pandora represents the little bit of innocence and hope that still exists in this story. At first, Kratos resists, but over time he begins to be touched by this little glimmer of hope. He begins to change, if only a little. He finally begins to care about someone else. He wants to protect her. Unfortunately, in order to complete his journey and achieve his wish to kill Zeus, Pandora must die in the flame of Olympus. In the climax of the game, there comes a moment when Kratos must make a choice. He can either save Pandora and let Zeus go, or he can let go of Pandora, allow her to die, so he can kill Zeus. This is the moment when he has an opportunity to prove that he has changed. But Zeus' words here are so despicable, so evil, so antagonistic that Kratos cannot stop himself from becoming enraged. In the end, due to his anger, he makes the same choice he has been making for this entire story. He chooses to let Pandora go. He chooses violence for the last time. This final crisis point is given far more emotional weight than any of the previous ones. As I said earlier in the video, God of War 3 was already putting a lot more focus on its characters and story. By this point in the game, the developers and writers have spent a lot of time developing Pandora and Kratos' relationship, have shown us the conflict within him, the two sides of his personality warring against each other, both his ugly, violent self who cares about nothing but revenge, and also the side of himself who wants to be better, who wants to have someone to care for, who wishes for peace. In my opinion, this moment is the closest Kratos ever came in the original trilogy to becoming a fully developed and emotionally complex character. but that is the exception. For most of the series, he is essentially making the exact same choices and expressing the exact same emotions as he was at the very start of the first game. And to be clear, simple does not mean bad. As a writer, you create characters to fulfill the needs of the individual story you are trying to tell. Not every story needs or would even benefit from extremely complex multi-dimensional characters. In the same way that, contrary to what every asshole on the internet believes, showing is not always better than telling. The first God of War was a relatively simple fable mimicking the story beats of ancient Greek tragedies. Kratos was a simple character because that is what the story called for, not because it was flawed. The ancient Greek epics and tragedies do not have particularly complex characters either, and I don't care what anyone says. Kratos in the original trilogy is not any less complex than Achilles in the Iliad or Odysseus in the Odyssey, and obviously those remain, to this day, celebrated characters in world culture. Kratos only becomes a more complex character in the Norse games because that is what those new stories require. In just God of War 4, not even including the events of Ragnarok, Kratos undergoes a more dramatic change than he does in the entirety of the 6 Greek games. He goes from being a character incapable of discussing the truth of his past, incapable of showing his son affection, incapable of trusting others, and having absolutely no clue how to guide his son, to becoming a character who is open and honest about who he is, who easily expresses physical affection, is far more confident as a parent, and is able to trust and even befriend others. That is some serious character growth. But wait, is character development really defined by growth? By a character learning to make new choices? Is that the only way to write a complex character? Well, no, not necessarily. For example, both Baldur and Odin never learn how to make new choices, and I would still describe them both as well-developed characters. Once again, it is a question of pacing and time. We spend so much time with Odin, listening to him explain in his own words what his motivations are, why he is doing everything that he is doing, why he cannot change. There are several long cutscenes where Odin just monologues for a while, and in addition to those, we get tons of scenes of him interacting with different characters, and we see how his behavior changes depending on who he is interacting with. And there is a ton of backstory from other characters discussing his past too. This is also what makes the climax of God of War 3 feel more meaningful than previous games, even though Kratos is technically just making the same choice he always makes. So to finally answer the questions I posed at the beginning of the video, yes, the way stories are told and characters are written in the God of War series has changed over time. The stories have become much slower paced, spend more time developing their characters, and give those characters more space to express a wider range of thoughts and feelings, leading to a deeper emotional experience for the audience. However, as we have seen, this change did not begin with the Norse games, and the Norse games are not telling a new story. They are simply a slower and more thoughtful exploration of the exact same themes God of War has always been delving into. Whatever narrative depth the new games contain could not exist without the foundation laid by the old games. If Kratos had really just been a mindless, brainless monster in the old games, then he could never have become the complex and mature character of the new games. The depth was always there, even when it was not the primary focus of the series. As I said at the beginning, the purpose of this video was to take the first God of War video essay I ever produced, an essay that I'm not really happy with anymore. I do like to believe that my writing and analysis have improved some in the past 2 years of doing this. Well, to take that old video and to do it better, to write a more thoughtful and more thorough exploration of the topic, and I hope I have achieved that. But I am not done yet. The second God of War video essay I ever posted to this channel was a story analysis of God of War Ragnarok, and to be honest, I am not very happy with that video either. So next time I am going to redo that video too. I am going to post a better story analysis of God of War Ragnarok.